Catherine has a problem with the camera, so we cannot see her, but we can see the presentation, and we can also see we can also hear her, which is the main thing. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Claudio. Thank you for organising this new international centre with such energy and enthusiasm. I think this is exactly the right time for us to come together and do this work. I'm sure we'll do some great work together. Thank you also to everyone who's come along to this session. I know that, yeah, people are in very different time zones, some more convenient than others. Thank you to, I've seen some Peirce scholar colleagues on the participant list. Thank you to you for coming. I'll be very interested in your thoughts. And thank you also for some Deakin colleagues who I've seen on the list as well. All right, so I'll begin. This is work that I've been doing for the last 2 years, and I'm very excited to present it to you. So I'm going to start, here is the overall structure of my argument, and I'm going to start by looking at enactivism, a little look at enactivism as it's currently formulated, and then I'm going to pivot off that into my pragmatist cognitive semiotics. So I'm going to look at the so-called information processing challenge, which is discussed by Dan Hutto and his co-authors, and I'm going to use that to motivate a more semiotic approach based in Peirce. And it's interesting because the radical enactivists do venture a little bit into what they call teleosemiotics, but I'm going to suggest that Peircean semiotic conceptual equipment can take us further. So then I'm going to introduce a few ideas from Peirce's semiotics, which I will explain, his concept of a sign, and also his icon index symbol distinction. And then I'm going to use that drawing on some excellent recent work by Frederick Sternfeld to start building a teleosemiotic account of propositional structure. So I'm going to suggest that we can find propositional structure not only in so-called knowing that, for instance, Pierre knows that Paris is the capital of France, but also in the kinds of bodily interactions, bodily skills that Sean was talking about as well in his talk. So the ultimate goal is trying to knit together knowing that traditional propositional knowledge and the more bodily somatic knowledge that we all have. So this is ambitious, but I think it can be done with the help of Peirce. And my conclusion is going to be that representation within enactivism should be not repudiated, but reconstructed, a venerable pragmatist term there. So let's begin. The mind sciences have long rendered 17th century Cartesian understandings of knowledge as ideas in the head obsolete. Unquestionably, rather than ontologically separating mind and matter, we need to move to some kind of embodied cognition. And enactivism has been doing excellent work here, as we all know. Enactivism may be understood as the view that minds fundamentally interact with the world rather than representing it in some encapsulated and commodified content. This is a term of art, content, which you know, is very much an artifact of certain debates. And I think it's interesting to reflect that this whole idea of content as something that you can encapsulate and commodify and share around from mind to mind. This is a concept arguably first conjured by Descartes when he distinguished it in principle from the mental act, whatever it means to do that. So the famous act-content distinction. By contrast to that, enactivism holds that the world is enacted. We can't make this mind-body split, but the world is enacted through natural organisms' capacities for lived meaning-making. Thus, a key enactivist theme has been a so-called life-mind continuity thesis, which holds that the basic structures which create life are the basic structures which create mind. However, much current enactivist theorising is arguably too anti-intellectualist. For instance, many enactivists hold that for knowledge to be embodied, it must be non-representational. Rather than discrete representations of some kind of purported reality, we have, as Hutto and Mayan have put it, whole organism responses to environmental cues. But this defines the semantic against the behavioural, which I believe sets up a false dichotomy, which ironically recapitulates Cartesianism. Relatedly, I think, so far enactivists have arguably struggled to theorise so-called higher order cognition. These are things like logic, mathematics, hypothetical reasoning, imagination, and long-term planning. And human beings do appear to freely share information represented in abstracted propositional form. For instance, when we speak to one another, we read and write. So it seems that enactivism needs to explain at least the appearance of the encapsulated and commodified content. And the question arises, how can a theory of cognition that's framed purely in terms of whole organism responses to environmental cues account for this? So here I'm going to spend a little time talking about the radical enactivism of Dan Hutto and his co-authors, as this makes, I think, the strongest case against representational content. And also because, as I mentioned before, Hutto and Mayan advocate their own teleosemiotics. But having gestured in this interesting new direction, these radical enactivists do not develop the specifically semiotic angle of their view in much detail, I believe. And I'm going to bring Charles Peirce to the table here. So with Peirce's help, I will theorise signs as habits of associating specific cues with appropriate schemas of activity and ensuing experience. So pay close attention to these items in the green. So these are I'm going to follow these items through the talk. I'm going to keep them in green so you can pick up how they're functioning in the argument as I proceed. So notice these three things and notice that there are three. It's no coincidence because here we're talking about Peirce. So this account, I suggest, will resolve the anti-intellectualism problem by giving all embodied knowledge some kind of propositional structure, although interestingly, this will be not necessarily a linguistic structure. Hutto and Mayan have defined teleosemiotics as differing from teleosemantics because it does not involve content. Again, this is a contested and crucial term. They say content is defined in terms of either reference, truth, or accuracy. So basically, teleosemiotics, they say, is teleosemantics without the semantics. They claim that we need to provide an account of the determinate kinds of intentional directedness that organisms exhibit towards aspects of their environments that is free of these semantic notions. They criticise attempts to derive notions of reference and truth from naturalistic accounts of information, such as the idea that a tree's rings indicate and thus represent its age. They say, the number of a tree's rings can co-vary with the age of the tree. However, this doesn't entail that the first state of affairs says or conveys anything true about the second, or vice versa. All right, so now that was a little brief but I'm moving on now to talk about the pragmatist perspective on all of this. So I'm going to build a story from pragmatism to enactivism. Okay, so to build a Peircean pragmatist enactivism, I think the first step is to replace Cartesian ideas with habits. Habits form a far better basis for epistemology and philosophy of mind than Cartesian ideas, because they ontologically bridge body-mind dualism by being simultaneously embodied and intelligible. They also ontologically bridge the public-private distinction by being simultaneously observable in others and introspectable in oneself. Not infinitely introspectable, but of course, but to some degree. Habits, unlike ideas, are also teleological in the sense that they lead us into the future. Peirce said they take effect in external actions unless a particular inhibition has been laid upon them. So this, in effect, turns traditional or mainstream analytic philosophy of action on its head. So in mainstream philosophy of action, what requires explanation is doing something, whereas in this habit-based philosophy of action, the only thing that requires explanation is not doing the habit that you would normally do. Now, this enables Peirce to develop an account of meaning beyond Descartes' understanding of quote-unquote clear and distinct ideas, looking instead to expectations regarding agency in a lived context. So this teleological dimension of habits means that they're always already kind of future directed, and you're always in the middle of a set of habits which structure your world with this set of expectations regarding agency in a lived context. In his famous paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, Peirce distinguished 3 grades of clarity that we can attain with respect to the meaning of our concepts. The first grade of clarity is where we can just identify instances of the concept without necessarily being able to say why or how. The example I always give is the judge at the notorious obscenity trial of the book Lady Chatterley's Lover. This judge remarked that although he could not define the term obscenity, he knew it when he saw it. That's the first grade of clarity. The second grade of clarity is being able to give a verbal or nominal definition of the concept. And in philosophy, we often see the attempt to provide so-called necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of the concept. This is a kind of a dictionary definition level of clarity. The problem with dictionary definitions, though, is that you can find word A being defined in terms of word B, and then you look up word B in the dictionary, and then it's defined in terms of word A, and so you're going around and around in a circle. So the third level of clarity, Peirce calls the Pragmatic Maxim. He also calls it the Experimentalists' theory of assertion. And here we note that if a hypothesis is true, what experience should I anticipate? So note that unlike the second level of clarity, we're now going to the world and we're having expectations and subsequent experiences. We're having a real encounter, if you like. Peirce gives a nice illustration of this third level of clarity with respect to the concept lithium. He says, if you look into a textbook of chemistry for a definition of lithium, you may be told that it is that element whose atomic weight is 7. But if the author has a more logical mind, he will tell you that if you search among minerals that are vitreous, translucent, grey or white, for one which imparts a crimson tinge to an unluminous flame, the mineral being triturated with lime, etc., etc., etc. And here he goes into just a huge set of procedures, which is what the chemists in the lab at his day were actually doing to create a sample of lithium. He describes the whole process, and then he ends by saying the material of that is a specimen of lithium. He notes the peculiarity of this definition is that it tells you what the word lithium denotes by prescribing what you are to do in order to gain a perceptual acquaintance with it. So this is why it's the experimentalists' theory of assertion. This third level of analysis effectively transforms every concept into a series of hypothetical conditionals. Each hypothetical conditional consists in a schema of activity and ensuing experience. Notice I've got my green items here again, and crucially, a habit of associating that cue with that schema. So this is going to be a fundamental structure in my new account. In short, when given a certain cue, the agent has been trained to expect that certain acts will be accompanied by certain experiences. And I have to say here, I owe a lot to Sandra Rosenthal and her very insightful work on Peirce's Pragmatic Realism. Really advise you to check it out. Excellent work. Okay, so if the agent engages in the act and the anticipated experience does not appear, then this triggers the agent to engage in learning. Such learning involves adjusting one's expectations, usually by means of further acts. Often in the case of science, these acts are experimentation, until the hypothetical conditional set reaches a new equilibrium of expectations that are generally realised. So this is the well-known cycle of inquiry that we find in pragmatism, which goes, around and around and around, as in the diagram in the bottom right corner. And this is what makes an organism's life intelligible. Now, whether this means that the organism's life is a narrative is an interesting question that I've been thinking about since Sean's talk. And Sean was urging us to avoid the dreaded problematic pan-narrativism. So anyway, we're still thinking about that and discussing that. But in any case, we have this cycle of inquiry where the cue sets off the act and the expectation, and then that's either successful or unsuccessful, and the organism is continually cycling around, trying to reduce nasty surprises to a minimum. And that is life as well as mind. All right, so now I come to the next section of the talk. And so here I'm going to outline just a few key concepts in Peirce's semiotics that I'm going to draw on. I know Peirce's semiotics frightens a lot of people. It can seem very dense and forbidding in terms of the terminology that he uses. I do think it's fundamentally quite an elegant system. So in any case, I'm going to explain a few concepts here, and when we come to question time, I'm happy to explain more for any non-Peirce specialists in the audience. So first of all, and most crucially, there is Peirce's definition of what a sign is. So he famously claimed a sign is not a sign unless it translates itself into another sign in which it is more fully developed. So a sign basically points to an object, but then it must also be interpreted as picking out that object, and each further interpretation of that sign as picking out that object is a further sign. So each interpretation is a further sign, which then triggers further interpretations, which are further signs. And that is what makes a sign, basically, that continued ongoing process of interpretation. Peirce called this the sign's interpretant, but he just means the interpretation of the sign. So again, we've got three things: sign, object, and interpretation. So we can see this as a formal analysis of intelligibility as repetition, I think. And in this formal analysis of intelligibility as repetition, we already see how signs are themselves habits of a special kind. So that's the definition of a sign. So now I'm going to talk about three different kinds of signs that Peirce distinguished. So these are icons, indices, and symbols. And this is a distinction between three different ways in which a sign can pick out its object. So icons pick out an object by themselves resembling it, by themselves having some of the qualities that are being signified. So this is a map. This is a classic example. The structure of the map itself is what shows you the shape of the landmass that it's a map of. Secondly, indices pick out an object by means of some existential connection. So when I point, so we need two things. We need an object and a pointer, or a name that's conferred by baptism, which is not a description, but just, again, a word which points to an object in some kind of brute dyadic sense. And then thirdly, we have symbols, which pick out an object via some kind of arbitrary convention or rule that needs to be learned. So if you think of the English word elephant, this picks out the animal, the elephant, only for English speakers who have specifically learned that this random word is what picks out this particular animal. So in that sense, for symbols, we have an arbitrary convention or rule which mediates the relationship between the sign and object in a way that doesn't happen with the indices, where we have a direct pointing. So the indices are a dyadic relationship. The symbols are a triadic relationship with sign, object, and arbitrary convention. Okay, so all English words are symbols because we need to learn the word and the connection between that word and that thing. Although some English words are also indices insofar as they also have an indexical function. So the word here, for instance, is indexical insofar as it's used just to directly indicate the point where it's uttered, but it's also a symbol insofar as we have to learn that it's the word here that indicates place, whereas it's the word I that indicates the person, and so on. So these three categories are not mutually exclusive. Particular real world signs can exemplify more than one of these three categories. Okay, so icons' key function is to represent schematic structure by embodying it non-discursively, embodying the structure within the sign itself, as we saw with a map. So in the terms of Wittgenstein, this is showing, not saying. Now, crucially, I believe that this structure includes logical form. I've published a number of papers arguing this, and I think this is really important. I'll talk about this later. So logical form, I think, is actually structural and iconic. Now, indices' key function is to determine what in the world a concept or proposition is about through establishing some kind of existential connection with the world, existential connection or encounter with the world, unmediated by general concepts. Peirce commented that a key role of the index is precisely to focus the sign user's attention on something salient. So we could actually call an index a cue. So note my green items are floating around here on the screen in a hopefully suggestive way. Now, thirdly, the key function of symbols is to represent general concepts. So this is the kind of classic philosopher's conceptual. General concepts like white or metal. Such concepts are indefinitely generalizable, and they become more useful the further they are entrenched. So the more you use a concept like metal, the more you'll be able to generalize it across your experience in useful ways. So symbols constitute habits in that sense. So remember my hypothetical conditional on the earlier slide. So we can begin to see, I think, how these three sign types might work together to create all meaning if we consider how and why organisms might have evolved habits of connecting certain cues with certain schemas of activity and subsequent experience. So, yeah, from an enactivist perspective, where we think about the organism making its way in trying to survive in a hostile world, hopefully this is suggestive. So here we come to the slide, which is really the crux of the presentation. So, and here is where I think we can align the bios and the semios. So, which I'm iconizing in my colors here. So remember, on the biological side, we have the act experience schema, we have the cue, which cues the agent to expect to do and experience this schema. And then we have the habit of connecting that cue with that schema. Now, on the semiotic side, I'm going to align the act experience schema with an icon. I'm going to align the cue with the index. I'm going to align the habit of connecting that cue with that schema with Peirce's symbol. All right, so let's explore this alignment. And I think the important thing, and the thing that I promised at the start of this talk, was that I was going to use this to give you an account of propositional structure, and then from that, comes a kind of restoring sufficient intellectualism to enactivism. Okay, so in developing or presenting this account of a teleosemiotic propositional structure, I'm going to draw on a really excellent work that's been done by Friedrich Sternfeld on naturalizing Peirce's theory of the proposition in his book, which is called Natural Propositions. A recent book, which I've been talking about a lot because I'm very excited about it. All right, so in this book, Sternfeld explores how later in life, Peirce placed his theory of propositions within a broader account of what he called DC signs. So a DC sign is his technical term for a proposition, but a propositional structure which Peirce saw extending beyond language. So, for instance, it can embrace photographs. A photograph of Obama in India is a DC sign insofar as in the right context, it can be used to make a statement. So let's say you say to me, Obama, never went to India during his presidency. He completely neglected the subcontinent. Then I pull out this photograph and I just present it to you. In this context, and let's say you believe me, of course, we know that Photoshop can do evil things, but of course, I could be lying, but in any statement, in any linguistic statement, I could also be lying. But this is clearly a statement in this context where I say, no, you're wrong. Obama was in India. So a DC sign is any sign which can be used to make a statement. Formal analysis, which Stjernfeld explains very well, I think, in the book, which is the formal structure of any sign which makes a statement in this sense. So a DC sign / proposition is any sign which says something about something. So there's a particular double structure which enables this making of a statement. The way Peirce puts it is to say a proposition is a sign which separately or independently indicates its object. And speaking semiotically, how this happens is that we have an index or a pointer or a cue, and an icon, aka schema, which are fused together, thereby forming a symbol, so that something in the world is both picked out and described at the same time. This is what gives you a proposition. Again, I'll quote Peirce. He says, every proposition is a compound of two signs, of which one functions significantly, the other denotatively. The former is intended to create something like a picture in the mind of the interpreter. That's the icon. The latter is to point out what he is to think of that picture as being a picture of. That is the index. So if we just take the very simple statement, snow is white, we've got this index and the icon, pointing out something and saying that it is white at the very same time. This is what enables us to make statements and convey information. Okay, I think this is really fundamental and really we can do a lot with this. So let's explore this propositional analysis of lived experience further by means of an example. So this is going to be an example of knowing how to catch a tram. This is a Melbourne example. So a woman is waiting to catch a tram. She is well practiced in riding public transport, which includes a general habit of boarding a tram that she wishes to catch as it stops. She's done this many times before. She knows how to do it. Now let's imagine that she perceives a tram stopping beside her. Now we have a specific event, the tram stopping. This cues her habit to move her legs and arms in a schematic way. It's a very specific way in which you board a tram. They have new trams now, it's getting easier, but this is kind of how it was in the old days. She activates her tram boarding schema, and this results in her experiencing a successful tram boarding. So again, we've got our structure, we've got our particular cue. We'll call this an index. We've got her schema of bodily movement and anticipated experience, and we have a habit of associating this cue with this schema of bodily movement and anticipated experience. Here we have it. This is our propositional structure in human behaviour. All right, so the count. And now I'm going to draw some conclusions. And once again, this is going to be representation, not repudiated, but reconstructed. Many radical and activist arguments against content seem predicated on the assumption that it must be largely or wholly symbolic in Peirce's terms of Peirce's definition of the symbol as the sign which is created by an arbitrary convention. We see this in Hutto and Mayen's dismissal of the tree rings as obviously not the sort of things that content could be. But insofar as a tree ring is directly caused by the passage of the seasons of 1 year, within Peirce's semiotics, it counts as a serviceable index of that year. Peirce's semiotics also opens the possibility of iconic content. We've seen that Peirce claims that the key function of iconic signs is to represent schematic structure by embodying it non-discursively, by showing, not saying, the structure. Now, crucially, as I mentioned earlier, this schematic structure includes logical form. Well, I've argued that anyway. So if I'm right, this means that iconic signification, in fact, lies at the heart of rationality. It's very ironic, actually. And I believe this holds the key, in fact, to theorising the higher order cognition that we earlier saw is lacking in much current enactivism, at least arguably. Sean might have something to say here. In fact, Peirce's icon holds the key to a special kind of generality, which differs from the symbolic generality, which is what philosophers usually talk about. So if we think of symbolic generality as what the early modern philosophers discussed as abstract ideas, so this would be, for instance, the idea of whiteness that we think of as corresponding to the linguistic term white. And, you know, we've seen a lot of arguing in philosophy about whether these abstract ideas represent anything real. So when we have a symbolic concept which we generalize, you know, are we just doing that on the basis of a name, or are we talking about a real property, etc., 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 etc.? Now, iconic generality is not this, it's something else. And only by means of Peirce's semiotics can we even glimpse what this is. But Peirce used a very interesting metaphor for iconic generality, which was the composite photograph. The composite photograph was a 19th century technology whereby photographs were superimposed indefinitely on top of one another. In the 19th century, they would take a photographic plate and they would just keep exposing it multiple times. And this gives you a kind of a pictorial average. So a more recent example is video artist Nancy Burson's beauty composites of the 1950s and of the 1980s, respectively. So the one on the left is Joan Crawford and Marilyn Monroe and those other stars of the Hollywood screen, and the one on the right is Brooke Shields and other beauties of the 1980s. And you see how this gives you a kind of a pictorial average. It gives you a way of generalizing which is non-linguistic and non-conceptual in the symbolic sense. So Peirce believed that habits themselves partake in this second iconic kind of generality. Habits embody a schematic logical structure, which is not a symbolic logical structure, which gives rise to the schemas of activity and ensuing experience, which explicate the meaning of our concepts under pragmatism. Again, Sandra Rosenthal is very insightful on this. She notes that Peirce takes from Kant the fundamental insight that concepts are empirically meaningful only if they contain schematic possibilities for their application to sensible experience. But she also notes that Peirce rejects Kant's relegation of schemata to the productive imagination as opposed to the faculty of judgment. So there was a real wrong turn here. Rather, both faculties, imagination and judgment, combine to produce and mobilize schemata in a creative functioning of habit as providing a lived or vital intentionality between knower and known. Thus, she says, lived experience reflects a semiotic structure operative at its most fundamental level, since human behaviour is meaningful behaviour. We all know that, right? Rosenthal notes that this schematic structure, in fact, enables an original account of objectivity, and thus the truth and reference that Hutto et al. Deny. So, and this is a very interesting account of objectivity, which is very different to what much mainstream analytic philosophy has assumed that objectivity must consist in terms of a kind of pure dyadic relations between words and objects. By contrast, Rosenthal suggests that objectivity is constituted by a composite photograph of multiple agentive perspectives on a given object. Here, each perspective on the object has its own subtly different, yet structurally similar, overlapping set of cues associated by habit to schemas of activity and ensuing experience. She says, precisely what it means to see an object or objective structure, rather than an appearance only, is to fill in the resulting appearance of a particular act with the results of other possible acts given other possible cues. Thus, in a sense, there are an indefinite number of cues, acts, and resultant appearances. Yet, in another sense, they're all part of the one result. This is how what is apprehended is not an appearance only, but a perspective of an object. So, finishing up now, it is plausible to align what many philosophers refer to as the conceptual with what Peirce refers to as the symbolic. Of course, this is not a completely neat fit. There's lots of different discussions and different philosophers using the term conceptual in slightly different ways. Nevertheless, there's a broad, I think there's some kind of broad alignment here. Because of the way in which the Peircean symbol is defined by the arbitrariness of its generalization and the strong link between the Peircean symbol and the linguistic. So if we do make this alignment, if we do see what many philosophers refer to as the conceptual, as what Peirce refers to as the symbolic, then we can see how propositional content can be not necessarily conceptual or fully conceptual. I think this has been a stumbling block for a lot of thinkers in this area. So due to the essential involvement of icons and indices, we can have, non-conceptual propositional content. So Sternfeld explains this well. He says, the Discursive doctrine claims that there are quasi-propositions already in perception, and the same goes for externalized DC signs in books, pictures, computers, and elsewhere, which may display parts which are not exhaustible by concepts, like gestures, images, diagrams, etc. Thus, it is a source of error to assume propositions are conceptual through and through. They may involve both conceptual and non-conceptual representational contents. What is essential to content, though, it now appears, which might be surprising, is the subject-predicate form, which is represented in our Peircean teleosemiotics by the index icon fusion. What Peircean semiotics shows us is that, perhaps surprisingly, this structure outruns the linguistic sphere. Sternfeld conjectures that a subject-predicate form of information processing is very ancient in living organisms, drawing on the work of neurolinguist James Herford, who seeks to align it with the ventral dorsal split in the brain, such that the dorsal stream assigns indices to a small number of tracked objects, and then the ventral stream applies general categorizations to those tracked objects. Now, of course, this is empirical speculation. It's subject to other empirical argument, but I think it's very suggestive. And such researches constitute fascinating fuel for developing a specifically Peircean life-mind continuity thesis. All right. In conclusion, the real solution to the hard problem of content, I think, which is theorized by Hutto and Mayan, the real solution lies not in abandoning the notion of content altogether, at least for basic minds, as the radical enactivists do, but in broadening our concept of logic and information beyond the linguistic. In fact, yeah, which might sound paradoxical, but it's not. In fact, this possibility is beginning to be highlighted and explored by cognitive scientists. There's a really great paper by Williams and Colling, which is called From Symbols to Icons, The Return of Resemblance in the Cognitive Neuroscience Revolution, which goes into a lot of fascinating detail about this. Here is just one quote from that paper. They say, "A genuinely representational explanation of some phenomenon must satisfy the following condition. The properties by which internal representations represent must be responsible for their systemic role within the broader mechanism of which they are a part. With iconic representations, the property responsible for their representation of a given domain, namely resemblance, doubles up as the property by which they perform their systemic role." Now, I just want to note in closing that this Peirce and Cognitive Semiotics arguably still constitutes a radical enactivism in certain senses dear to Dan Hutto and his co-authors. For instance, this Peirce and Cognitive Semiotics holds that cognition is essentially extensive, not merely contingently extended. By this, I mean that there is no separate mental sphere or any other encapsulated and commodified notion of content on this account. But crucially, this does not mean that intentionality has no logical structure. A crucial and damaging elision has taken place here. Hutto's radical enactivism fails to see that logical and semantic relations may fail to be encapsulated and commodified, yet they may still be present. This is because such relations may be semiotically implicit in an agent's own habits, with all of the rich schematic structure they embody, which is much too complex to ever be made fully explicit. Yeah, this paper exists in a written version. If you'd like a copy, please email me. And that's it. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So as usual for a beautiful presentation, so thank you so much. We have time for discussing what you have presented. So as usually, you simply just click the small hand, and then we give you the word, so we can just start with the question. You can ask to talk, and then we. So the first one, we have Stephen Asma. We are going. Stephen, you can just turn your microphone on and turn your video on, your camera on, and just ask your question. Okay.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I really appreciate it. I'm very sympathetic to the argument. One question I had was, where do you see the affective or emotional content entering into this system? I like the idea that propositional content or propositions would contain non-conceptual content like icons, and I think generally speaking this is right. But I'm wondering, when I think about iconography images, I think they're already sort of preloaded with affective content, sort of approach, avoid, affective, I don't know, maybe somatic markers or something like this. Anyway, I'm just wondering, have you thought much about the affective content? And if you could speak to that, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's all part of the schema, because the schema is an act and then ensuing experience. That includes the affective, along with, you know, perception and all of the other aspects of experience. So pragmatism has a rich notion of experience, which is not, yeah, just like pictures on a movie screen. So yes, absolutely, that's an important part of it. Thanks.
So we have Sean.
Okay, so thanks, Kathy. It was a very clarifying talk. I tried to keep up with the whole thing. I have two, I think probably very minor clarifying questions, just so I can get clear about some things. One is that you said all English words are symbols, and I imagine that also includes Italian words and words in other languages as well. Yeah, so my question is about a word like ouch. If we count that as a word, I'm not sure that, at least if I utter ouch, that I'm using it as a symbol. But maybe you can explain, you know, how that word is a symbol. And the other question is about the icon. The example you gave of the woman getting on the trolley, where you described her kind of habitual movement, her body schematic processes of climbing onto the trolley. I think you said that counted as an icon. I'm not quite sure I understand why. So if you could explain that, that'd be great.
All right, no problem. So first of all, yeah, the word ouch. It's a, yeah, interesting word. I think it's potentially all three: icon, index, and symbol. So it's most fundamentally an index, I think, because you have a horrible pain, and you exclaim "ouch" as a way of kind of, you know, just pointing to your pain. But it's a symbol insofar as you have learned to make the word ouch. You've learned to say ouch rather than say banana when you feel a sudden sharp pain, whereas a child would just yell or scream. But there's some kind of training that's gone on with you so that you've actually learned that it's the word ouch that's appropriate here. It might also be an icon insofar as the way that you say the word, your tone might actually in some ways be resembling your pain. So if you have a sharp pain, you might say ouch in a sharp tone of voice, or if your pain is, you know, just a rumbling niggle, then you might be just like in a way that somehow iconizes the pain. So yeah, it could be all three. And yeah, hopefully that makes sense how I'm using that three-way distinction there. Please, you know, ask me ask me more, or if you want me to explain more about that. Now, with the trolley, you're asking, yeah, how is it an icon? The jumping on the trolley, what she knows how to do. So I would say it's an icon because there's some kind of structural mapping in her, well, not her brain, but there's some kind of structural. She has some kind of body schema, which she has some kind of organized control over, if you like. And so, you know, I don't know the exact mechanisms, but the fact that she mobilizes different structurally organized behavioral patterns, it's the structure that makes it iconic. if that makes sense. So any structural representation is an iconic representation.
Okay. Well, on the last point, or actually on both points, maybe I would say, when I'm saying "ouch," or if I'm jumping on the trolley, there's a kind of performativity involved. There's, I'm performing something, and I don't know that, at least in terms of the jumping on the trolley, I don't know that the schema is something like, I don't conceive of the body schema as a kind of internal map or an internal representation or anything like that. It's something that is constituted in by bodily skills and all kinds of different aspects here, not just something in the brain. So part of it is kind of enacted in the actual performance, I would say, rather than something just being in the organism that is called upon, like we would call upon a map. But that might be a difference in the way we conceive of that, but it shouldn't be a difference in the way we conceive of performance in some fashion.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on that point. So that was what I was trying to emphasize on my last slide by saying that cognition is essentially extended. So the cognition is in the habits. It's not in the brain mobilizing the habit. It is in the habit itself, and it's in the performance. And this is why I really like your work. Because you're also, you're also pushing out this idea. So, but it's when I present this notion of habits, it's very easy for people to default to the idea of the controlling mind driving the habit. But that, I think, is not how we should think about it ultimately.
Yeah, I'm definitely on the same page with respect to how you're describing habit. Yeah, it's just how it kind of fits into this semiotic scheme, I suppose.
Right. So if you think of a sign as something, that if something that can be a whole body thing, not just a mind thing, and that is always how Peirce thought of it. And in fact, Peirce has a whole cosmology of signs in which we humans, even our human bodies, are only a tiny fraction. So, but when you hear sign, we have so much training in the old representationalism that we default to the Cartesian thinking without realizing we're doing it. So we have to fight against that, I would say.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you, Katie. Katie, I kindly ask you to stop the sharing of your screen so people can ask and be recorded. And we have E8. I don't know the name, but
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, that's Eric Tate. I abbreviated.
Yeah.
I'm also very sympathetic to all of this and the directions Peirce is being taken in here, and especially in biosemiotics as well. My question again relates to Peirce and the division of signs. You actually gave an example of an icon as a map. And that seems to be what we normally think of when we first sort of are learning about icon index symbol differences, is that icons are things that resemble other things. So a thing like a map or a painting. And I guess my question is, are we as away from this mind body or mind matter split as we want to be here? Because it does seem like we still have entire classes of icons that are, things which resemble other things. And then we have, you introducing the idea of icons as these sorts of neo-Kantian schemas. And I'll say I am reading Sternfeld's book, Diagrammatology, as well, so I'm sort of deep into these questions right now. But I was wondering, how do we get from the idea of icons as just things that refer to other things by resemblance to the idea of it being something that structures the way we behave in the world? That's sort of my question there.
Yeah. So if you think about the composite photograph metaphor and the way that Rosenthal uses it to build an original account of objectivity, then there is within the different perspectives of an object that, for instance, we might have over time, which hold together our sense of there being an enduring thing. Then there's a whole lot of partial identity. Partial identity between, I'm getting a bit of external noise. Partial identity between, how I see the object, my perspective on the object today, my perspective on tomorrow, my perspective on the next day. They're not exactly the same, but they sufficiently resemble one another for me to hold them together in a sense of an enduring object. So, and then if we think about our habits, the way that we practice same habit in different situations. So, I board a tram, sufficiently similar way, but on different street corners at different times of day with different types of tram, etc., etc. Once again, there's differences, but there is sufficient resemblance or partial identity for this to be, in some real sense, the same habit. Does that help?
Yes,
Okay.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks.
Okay, so it's my turn. I also ask. I'm seeing a couple of experts in habits, so don't be shy. I won't call you, but there are at least a couple of experts in habits in the audience. So Kathy, thank you very much. I want to go, go a little bit deeper into technicalities in some way, but also for stressing some other way arounds that we can through we can see the problem in some way. I would say a much more enactivist idea. The hard problem of content in some way starts from the relationship to analytical philosophy in some way. So content is a kind of way that through which analytical philosophy thinks about meaning, then comes from an analytical tradition in some way. So if you take a Peircean idea of meaning, meaning is a habit according to Peirce. So it's the pragmatic maxim is a theory of meaning. I would say that you don't even have the hard problem of content in some way if you take a Peircean semantic, a pragmatist semantics, because this is a way of answering the way analytical philosophy thinks about meaning. This is my first point.
Yeah,
if you take the Peircean,
totally agree.
Yeah, this was the first one. I've got a second one. Maybe in the second one we disagree a little bit. If you take this, if you take this point of view in some way, I totally agree with you that habit is a kind of crucial notion in order to think about the way we move from perception to higher cognition in some way. But for instance, if we take Sternfeld's book, and I'm totally with you when you say we have to broaden our concept of logic and information beyond the linguistic. But is it what Frederick is doing in some way, or is it trying to find a kind of propositional structures also in non-propositional domains, which I think is the way Frederick works in some way in his book. But if you take Peirce, it's clear to me in some way that it's not the way he's moving. The main idea is perception. Peirce says that you have perception also in high-order inferences. For instance, in a deduction, you see the conclusion inside the inference in some way. So there is, we have the habit of thinking the Peirce is telling that you have inference in perception. For me, it's the other way around. The Peirce tells very clearly, if you have inference in perception, it's because inference is because inference is perceptive in some way. This is much more an enactivist way of putting things in some way. And the key concept in this, more than dividing between indexes, symbols, and all that, and icons, is to me diagrammatic thinking. You were quoting in a perfect way that all this problem about schematism, the imagination, or the problem of embodying in the domain of sensibility some high-order conceptual structure. Peirce stresses very clearly that diagrams are schemata, are schema in a Kantian way. And Peirce also tells that if Kant had studied schemata, he would have not thought about, if Kant had studied diagrams, he would have not thought about schemata, something like that, because schemata are diagrams in some way. And diagrams are this kind of, I would say science that embody in the sensible world some high-order structure, keeping the very same form of relations, because the object of a diagram is a form of relation. So if you take this way, it's quite all that comes quite naturally. It comes in a much more enactivist way in some way, with the primacy of perception and with the key idea of diagrams as the very core business of the relationship between the higher cognitive logic and the low-level perceptual way of doing.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the diagrams are really important, and the diagrammatic thinking is really important. And yes, I've published some papers arguing that logic is essentially, diagrammatic. Logical form is essentially diagrammatic. I tried to get some of the analytic guys who are working on various programs in the foundations of logic interested in my ideas on this. Haven't had a huge amount of uptake, but anyway, I'll keep plugging away. And yes, I think this is the key for getting some higher order cognition into enactivism. So I don't see anything at all to disagree with in what you said.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So we have Juan Miranda. Juan, you can.
Yes.
Your microphone.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting talk. I appreciate very much that you are like
We cannot hear you anymore, Juan. I think you got disconnected. Okay, maybe we just move to the last question by Brian Campbell, and then we just, no, Juan is coming back. Maybe we can wait for him.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I lost connection. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was saying that, well, you mentioned knowledge that yourself, and this sort of awakened this knowledge how, knowledge that debate. And well, first I am curious about what your position is regarding this debate. If you would say that one of the two is reducible to the other, or how you would situate the debate in terms of Peirce's pragmatism. But then again, this leads to another question, because since you were talking about propositional knowledge, this question might sound silly, but it's like, what is propositional about propositional knowledge? You know, when Stanley and Williamson go so far as to saying that babies have propositional knowledge because when they are drinking milk and sucking successfully, it's like, yes, I'm having milk. So then this is sort of the proposition that you mentioned with the ouch, right? But then again, you can find lower order organisms that might also be capable of adapting their behavior, or of sensing and processing signals that will tell them, yes, this, what I am doing, is a way to do things, and that will reinforce the feedback loop that you showed in the beginning of your presentation. So how far low are we willing to go to ascribe propositions? Because as an engineer, I can think that a couple of capacitors and inductors put together will work as a successful feedback loop, and they will take in signals from the environment and react in appropriate ways and reinforce these responses. So I don't know, what do you think about, should we be speaking now about propositional knowledge, or rather talking about information, or what ways around this would you propose? Or maybe for you it is perfectly fine. I'm curious about your view on this.
All right, thanks, Juan. So on the knowing how, knowing that debate, so I just published a paper with my co-author Joshua Black last year, where I kind of got clear on all this stuff. So the paper's in Kentness. It's called What is Intelligence For? And yeah, it's got a subtitle, but which is long and complicated, but it's basically called What is Intelligence For? And so in that paper, we basically argue that knowing how and knowing that, those two categories are coextensive, which is a position that nobody in the knowing how, knowing that debate had explored before. And yeah, the way I do that is by identifying the propositional structure with the subject predicate structure, and then identifying that with the icon index fusion in the way that I explained in the paper today. So you asked, how far down does this go? Why not go all the way? So why not, if it is possible, as James Herford has suggested, to align this kind of thinking with the ventral dorsal split in organisms, then it goes very, very far back. In, you know, a vestigial form, but nevertheless in a real form. And so rather than saying, you know, this trivializes propositional structure in some sense, why not say that this is you know, a successful realization of the mind-life continuity thesis?
Well, thank you. My only observation would be that for me, signal processing would be a more natural term for this, and then you can go all the way down as you like, or information processing. But I think that proposition is like a term associated with a certain tradition, and that might end up being confusing. But I don't know, it's maybe a matter of taste.
Right. I don't think it's a matter of taste. I think, you know, terminology matters, and the genealogy of terminology matters. And insofar as a certain tradition wants to keep propositional knowledge for a very, you know, text-based kind of communication with which they feel familiar, to that extent that tradition might be getting in the way of scientific progress, not mentioning any names.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, Juan. Thank you, Catherine. We have Brian now. Brian, you can just turn your microphone on.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, for your presentation. A lot of interesting things to consider. But speaking of the importance of terminology and clarity thereon, I come from a perhaps somewhat different tradition of approaching semiotics. I wrote my dissertation under the inestimable John Dealey, So coming here from a bit of a scholastic background. And on that point, I wanted to maybe indicate first a historical note that I think the act-content distinction actually antedates in some way Descartes, in that it can be found in the late scholastic distinction between formal and objective concepts, that you start to see that separation of the mental act and the content of the act in that notion, which starts to arrive in the late 14th and 15th centuries. But I think that actually connects perhaps to another point here, that I hate to be that guy coming in towards the end of a Q&A and presenting a bit of a challenge, but I think on the notion of symbols, right, and what symbols mean and what they signify, you identified, unless I'm mistaken, in your presentation fairly early on, symbols as being conventional signs, which is a point that Peirce acknowledges in 1895, I believe, and it's in the Collected Papers, Volume 2, paragraph 340. He says the restriction of symbols to conventional signs, which was an error of his, that we have conventional sign vehicles, but that the symbol itself is actually a law or a regularity, that's what it is as a sign itself. And I think that speaks perhaps directly to this difficulty of overcoming the act and content distinction, that perhaps we need to, particularly if we're going to have a fusion between icon, index, and symbol, that we need to recognize the symbol as something more than merely a conventional sign, but that the conventional sign is simply the sign vehicle of the symbolic sign itself. And I think, I don't know if that actually helps contribute anything or maybe sparks any thoughts in your own approach to this. But I just thought maybe I'd point that out and see what your response might be.
Yeah, that's a very good point about the symbol, and I was speaking carelessly there. I'm always trying to, make I'm always conscious that Peirce semiotics can be very forbidding, and I'm always trying to boil it down and make the key ideas understandable. But yeah, you're right that the symbol ultimately rests on, it's not necessarily conventional, but it rests on a regularity, as you say, and that regularity might be conventional, but it might also be natural. And so then that takes us back into a more evolutionary conception of the symbol, which also assists in tracing back those lineages, those evolutionary lineages that we were talking about in the last question. So yes, interesting about the late scholastics. Descartes is this, very interesting transitional figure in that respect. But yeah, in any case, the notion of content is still alive and well and needs to be confronted. But yeah, maybe you and I could email about the finer details. I would really like that.
Good, yes, thank you.
Any more questions from the audience? Everyone is satisfied?
Great.
It looks like nobody wants to tell something. So we just say thanks to Catherine for your wonderful presentation and for giving us the chance to discuss your ideas and cognitive semiotics by Peirce and connected to enactivism. So thank you very much, Kathy, for your work and your presentation.
Thank you so much, Claudio, for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure. So we just say goodbye. We will make an applause, a virtual applause. Just a couple of announcements. Victoria, Sean. Nice to see you all in the video. Just a couple of announcements. Our postdoc students, PhD students are working on the website of the center. So it will be ready next week. We're going to announce it on the Facebook page, so we can share it and all that. And about the series, see you in a couple of weeks. It's my turn, so I will talk about cognitive semiotics of this book that is coming out, trying to keep together enactivism, body simulation, material engagement theory, and cognitive semiotics. So thank you very much for being here. It's very late, at least in Italy, so it's midnight, so we can go to bed. And say thanks again to Kathy and to Vittorio, to Sean, and to all of you. So thanks a lot for being here. And see you soon.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.